uh, we'll open the floor for questions. Just draw my attention, introduce yourself, and please keep your questions short. We don't want long comments. We have about half an hour. We need to wrap up on time. Yeah, I know. So, yeah. So, throw if you can, if there are anybody people there who want to ask questions, could if you could just, yeah, sure. Please speak into the mic so that. Yes.
I would like to thank the panel for such an insightful discussion. My name is Surabhi. I'm from the International Organization for Migration. And as an agency which has been dealing with the problem upfront in Bangladesh, I would like to understand more about the situation that prevails currently. So, since, as you mentioned during your presentation, since 1982, Rohingyas have been disenfranchised technically from the citizenship, but they have continued to live there. So, what has escalated in the current situation that the backlash from the army has been so severe? Is this the military trying to reassert itself in the democratic transition which has been taking place? And it kind of also mirrors with the kind of anti-Muslim sentiments that we have seen in the rise across the world. Is it a reflection of that in Burma as well? Thank you.
Okay. I have one question and one comment. Question is related to the last part of the panel. Is there an economic basis to what is happening or the source or today's conflict? And two, what is the scope for economic institutions or development or whatever that might be to create the room for maneuver? Because otherwise it seems a very intractable problem. So that's the question. The comment is that we are seeing both the politics of populism, which in the West and is driven by polarization of economic polarization, while in Asia, and I would include places, since Ambassador Sharan is here, places like Indonesia also, you see what is happening. Somebody like Jokowi was also an iconic figure. He's seen his things evaporate. So the question I have is, and another example very similar about talking about refugees and people coming back, think about FARC in Colombia. So in all of these, when you have very, knot which is difficult to untangle, it ends up almost being necessary for some sort of an external broker or an honest broker, usually external, because the domestic people who might be enlightened are also hamstrung. What scope is there? I mean, you seem to be hinting at it. Have people been thinking about it?
And we'll take one more question and then we'll come back.
Hello, I'm Shripati. I'm a consultant in the MEA. A couple of issues I want to flag. So, if you take the Arsa attack of August 25th and also of last year's October and November attacks, they were highly coordinated, operating in large numbers, and with military precisions. In the last year's attack, they had also kind of boogie trapped the access routes to the camps where they were attacking to ensure that support and reinforcement does not reach the site. So, given this nature of attack, kind of maybe your take on that, sir, Ambassador. Second issue, sir, is that on the Rohingya, it is not only the Rohingyas, but almost it is not only the Brahmins, but even the other ethnic groups carry a xenophobic streak in their attitude. So, how is that going to play out? Third issue is on Suki's political capital. The by-elections of April, she won 9 out of the 18 seats. She losing the Shah state was acceptable because NLD has never won in Shah right from 1990. But in Karen, the USDP had made inroads. So what is the kind of dynamics that's going to come in play? And in that context, her political future when it comes to 2019 with Mabata repackaging itself. Final point, ma'am, on your take on the 21st century Panglong agreement, Panglong process. Just a small update. In May, the meeting finally took place, the February meeting. The Wa state army, which was not part of the entire process and was always outside, ended up becoming the focal point. After the Chinese ambassador had to literally cajole them to join the party, and now is the Wa, which is the focal point of the non-signatories. And one of the issues that the Shah and the Kachins have with the peace process and the national-wide ceasefire agreement, which the Tatmadwa and Aung San Suu Kyi is demanding, is that they had signed ceasefire agreements in the late 90s, And their point is that what is the utility of those agreements and why should we sign another one? Thank you.
The question about why has this happened now, I think I tried to explain that there was, in fact, these, what has now just now been mentioned, these coordinated attacks against 30 of the security posts, Myanmar security posts, which then led to a large-scale retaliation by the Myanmar security forces. And in that, as it usually happens, very innocent people are caught in the crossfire, in a sense. So this is the immediate trigger for what we are seeing has happened. The influx into neighboring countries has now perhaps become much less, but nevertheless the problem is very much there. The with respect to this whole issue of populism, I have no doubt in my mind that all the different actors are jostling for the next election, and I think they are particularly if the clergy is going to somehow take on a overt political role, maybe through the floating of a party, or are encouraged, as some people have suggested, are encouraged in the kind of attitudes we see by the military itself, because this narrows the space for somebody like Aung San Suu Kyi. So I think she is very much conscious of the fact that unless she handles this issue well, the electorate, in a sense, will be engulfed by this kind of sentiment. And whatever be the reasoned way of dealing with this, I don't think you will get much reason in the campaigning. So it is going to be, my sense is, it's a very depressing thing to say, but it does seem to me that if we are looking at somehow internally a situation being created in Myanmar, which could ensure the return of a substantial number of refugees in conditions of relative peace and security. At this point, I do not see, frankly, that happening. Should there be some external actor who makes this possible? I think that if there is an overt external intervention, it will only strengthen those populist sentiments. It will have exactly the opposite effect, which is the reason why whatever I would not say intervention, but whatever good offices are used by, say, countries like India or here, in fact. The one entity which could actually play an important role, which is the ASEAN, since Myanmar is after all a full member of ASEAN, has not actually done very much. So in fact, their whole approach has been in the past that let us not take a report card approach. Let us, in the ASEAN way is to do these things very quietly, very discreetly. Well, we do not see much of in evidence. So whether it is India or whether it is the ASEAN, the only way in which there can be some amelioration of the situation is precisely through those kind of conversations. And those conversations will have to include not just Aung San Suu Kyi, but of course the Myanmar army, and in a sense the fact that the Myanmar army is part and parcel of the ruling establishment, because as you Nimi mentioned, the the defense minister, the home minister, these are all people from the Myanmar army. Therefore, it is possible, perhaps, to through these kind of very discreet conversations, to at least see whether some improvement in the situation can be achieved. The security aspect I have already referred to. There is no doubt that there has been the ARSA has not only carried out what seem to be very planned, well-planned attacks, but there is evidence that they have links with other radical groups, and perhaps these links may even expand in the future, which is the reason why I think there is so much of disquiet and anxiety on the Indian side. But let me say this, that whatever be the security considerations that we have, which are genuine and legitimate, this still does not justify doing anything which targets innocent men, women and children. I think no security consideration should be allowed to, have a kind of a blanket, response. You should not be using a hammer. Maybe you should use a scalpel to take out what may be a dangerous situation. But I don't think that a blanket kind of response of say trying to deport all the Rohingyas, I certainly do not think. Number one, it would not only be against whatever humanitarian traditions we have, but I don't think it would be very effective either. The only way you can deal with these situations, as we know very well, is through much better intelligence, much better security, planning on our side, rather than to try and engage in this kind of deportation. So I don't think that would help. And lastly, I also wanted to just mention on the economic side that Rakhine actually, resources-wise, is a very, very, probably one of the richest provinces of Myanmar. One, agriculturally very, very rich. Perhaps many of you know that the port of Sitwe, which used to be known in the old days as Akyab, was actually a very important port on the rice trade that used to link Myanmar, Southeast Asia, Indian subcontinent, which is why it became such an important port. So it was very much part and parcel of rice trade, and a lot of the rice actually grown in Rakhine is supposed to be very good quality rice. Now, more recently, as you know, Rakhine State has also been where there have been large-scale gas finds, as well as oil wells which are being exploited. So there is actually a basis for a very, in fact, very promising economic development, and it is for this reason that we have made Rakhine a kind of a focus area for our cooperation with Myanmar. So the infrastructure development which is taking place is precisely taking place because we believe that actually this province, which has some very old connections with India, coastal shipping as well as across the border, could actually make a very big difference. Naturally, therefore, having more peace and stability in the region is to our advantage.
Nimi, do you want to come on?
So just a quick response. I think that's a very valid point you raised, sir, about whether there's an economic basis to the problem. Yes, but interestingly, we are not making it. Okay, and I'm glad we are not making it. India hadn't made this even in 1971 when we were faced far more economic challenges in terms of having a weaker economy. Even in 1971, when we were inundated with refugee flows, we did not make the economic argument. Now, that doesn't mean that economic costs do not exist. Of course, there are huge costs involved, And as you may know, the Indian postal so India actually pleads with the international community and the UNHCR for a better and more favorable sort of burden sharing arrangements in 71, only to be rebuffed very quietly. Because if you notice, much is made of the fact that India is not a signatory to the 1951 UN Convention. While it is definitely, it would be desirable if we were to sign it, there's a fair bit of history here that it might be useful to just extract in capsule form. We did not sign also because we were among the very few independent countries from the global south in 1951 which were intimately involved in the drafting process. And despite that, India's inputs were, it's a fact that India's inputs were not, included in the final convention, that it, because by and large it's a fair point that there's a Eurocentric bias to the entire the way in which the human rights law was framed. It largely based itself on European refugee movements and absolutely dismissed, as it were, migration movements and migration realities in South Asia. So that, to that extent, there is some element we can understand where in the Indian reservations come from. So that is, I think, the economic argument. So the long and short of it is that so in 1971, many of you may know, may not know, India then, the Indian Postal Service played a very crucial role. We had a refugee relief tax of 5 paise, and which we kind of that's what we dipped into to kind of to bail us out, because there's these millions, and we had to, even though by once the violence abated in Bangladesh, there was a successful repatriation. But the fact that we did not make the economic argument and we did not flout a customary international law norm, which is of the principle of non-refoulement. And so that is what I think is my biggest takeaway from that the economic argument story. So that's one. And second, sir, your point about the coordinated nature of the attacks, yes, but I would still push back and say that is one prism through which we are looking at the crisis as it's enveloping. But unfortunately, that has become the predominant in the only story we are telling the world, that the Rohingyas are a security threat, period. And if you see, there's a very subtle but very interesting pushback from the PDP in JNK, where the Chief Minister Mehbooba, she actually has rebutted the central government's dominant narrative on this, and said that the 23 the Rohingya camps that are there in Jammu do not harbor, there's no evidence of any anti-national activities among the Rohingyas there. So you see, I'm not so pessimistic. There are these subtle variations, except that the entire story gets hijacked the way it's presented. So that's so I wouldn't really think that that's the geopolitical. It's a case of willful blindness if you're going to only look at it through one eye, and that is the geopolitical lens. You mentioned the VA. For me, the most interesting story takeaway from the VA coming, the VA group coming, incidentally, it is Myanmar's largest ethnic armed group, the United VA State Army. And the VA comes on board after this cajoling and nudging by the Chinese. But the takeaway that I see is how China has positioned itself so remarkably as a big player in Myanmar's ethnic peace process. And when you look at China, you see actually there are two ways, different. There's a differentiation in its formal position. Formally, it follows a policy of non-interference. It says this is an internal matter, that we respect Myanmar's territorial integrity and sovereignty. But what is it doing on the ground? You may be aware, I'm not sure, but China has backed and continues to back the war. And I have friends who tell me in Myanmar that if you go to the streets in the war state, the street signs are in Mandarin. The currency, China's renminbi, is easily available. There is a fair bit of socio-cultural affinity that comes into strengthening a lot of this. Intermarriages are common. So China has positioned itself in a very, very formidable way, and mind you, it has done so quietly. And the last, so that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, as Bangladesh High Commissioner to Delhi, I have been talking a lot on the Rohingya issue for the last 2 months, and I fully treasure this opportunity to listen to some experts on this issue. The Rohingya issue has a very emotional dimension for every Bangladeshi. More so for me, because I was a young Pakistani diplomat in 1971 in Washington, D.C., when my country was under a very similar situation. And my Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, herself said that she remembers 71 days whenever she looks at these refugees coming from Myanmar. First, let me tell you, Shem, we have no bilateral problem with Myanmar, period. The only issue we had with Myanmar was the demarcation of the maritime boundary that has been resolved with the assistance of UNCLOS. So that has also been put aside. We have no bilateral problem. We have normal trade, economic ties with Myanmar. And you'll be quite surprised. We have even bought 100,000 tons of rice from Myanmar to feed the refugees who are taking shelter on our side. So much for our good relationship with Myanmar. My Prime Minister still believes that Aung San Suu Kyi should be given full flexibility so that she could also take some positive action in this regard. Prime Minister Hasina, during her speech at the General Assembly, submitted a 5-point program. And as you all know, in this 5-point program, she had said, Myanmar must unconditionally stop the violence and the practice of ethnic cleansing in the Rakhine state immediately and forever. Unfortunately, that has not happened. Even yesterday, we received 2,000 refugees, bringing the total close to 610,000 refugees taking shelter after the 25th August. This is in addition to the nearly another 350,000 refugees who have been taking shelter since 1978 at various phases. Number two, she had said Secretary General of the United Nations should immediately send a fact-finding mission to Myanmar, and as I told you, Ambassador Shamsharan, the visit has not taken place as Myanmar has not agreed to this visit. Number three, she has that all civilians, irrespective of religion and ethnicity, must be protected in Myanmar in safe zones which could be created inside Myanmar under the UN supervision. Now, the safe zone is basically a concept. What these refugees want is protection, dignity, and security so that they could live there and with dignity in that state. I have refugees coming during the recent mass exodus. Some of them were repatriated even in 78. Yesterday I saw a television interview. Somebody came and said, I was repatriated in 78 as a boy. Since then I have been repatriated once again in 92. And now I have come here, I am not going back. So we'll have to ensure security and guarantee. And fourthly, she had said, ensure sustainable return of all forcibly displaced Rohingyas in Bangladesh to their homes in Myanmar. And fifthly, she had said, the recommendation of the Kofi Annan Commission report must be immediately implemented unconditionally and in its entirety. Now, the Kofi Annan Commission report is not a UN Secretary General or UN-sponsored report. It is basically a Myanmari report. Aung San Suu Kyi had invited Mr. Kofi Annan to chair this group so that it gets certain respectability. The Myanmar's majority population were totally opposed to this commission report, even from the beginning. Even before the commission was even formed. It so happened that on the day it was published, that night the terrorist attack took place. Now, which one is cause and which one is effect, I am not going to question that. I am merely saying my government promptly condemned all terrorist acts. And we even offered to Myanmar that we are prepared to jointly patrol our border so that no terrorist can escape from their country. And even go one step further. If we wanted to say, if you want, we can go for a joint operation in the areas. Instead of responding to anything, Myanmar started sending out these people. Now, so far, they have been given temporary shelter in the districts of Cox's Bazar, which is adjoining to the Arakan state. I think Nimi has mentioned a lot about the history of Arakan state. If I really want to say the whole story, it's a huge story. You can't really finish it in 2 or 3 minutes. Basically, Arakan has always been an independent state, period. It had a good number of people who were migrated from the South Asian region. There are some people who came with the Arabs, settlers and Arab businessmen who had come here. And there are romantic stories of Alaul and Padini and all these stories which are all over the place. What happened is, it is the capture of this Arakan province by the Burmese government that prompted British to capture Burma. Because British did not want Burmese to take over Arakan. And once the Burmese captured Arakan, the British moved in and captured the whole of Burma. And until 1937, Nimi, Burma was a part of British India. So when the question of partition and other things came up, the Arakani citizens, they initially said, we are a princely state, we were captured by Myanmar. Either you make us an independent state, or you let us join South Asia, or India, or Pakistan, whatever it is. But Britain in 1937 decided, no, Myanmar's territory should be kept separate from Indian territory, undivided Indian territory. Anyway, after this independence of Myanmar, these Rakhine leaders kept on cooperating with these Buddhist leaders, and some of them were MPs and parliaments and ministers and whatnot. In 1982, they took away their citizenship once and for all. But Myanmar recognized 135 ethnic groups, but did not recognize the 136 Rakhines. Nimi, you have said that Rakhines were on the wrong side. They were not on the wrong side, they were on the victim side. When Japanese captured Myanmar, it is the British which asked Myanmaris to face the Japanese aggression. And they did put up a fight in favor of the British. It's a story of betrayal, and they were betrayed, basically. But I'm not going into the long history of Rakhine. This is a very sad history. Now, the other dimension about which none of you mentioned, perhaps I may add something. Even before 25th August, 150,000 Rohingya refugees are living in Malaysia. 200,000 Rohingya refugees are living in Saudi Arabia. But my Saudi colleague told me the other day, I don't know how serious he was. He said it is well over 200. It is closer to 400,000. And roughly 1.1 million are living in Bangladesh. Indonesia has another 10,000. Pakistan has something like 50,000. India has something like 40,000. And that prompted Foreign Affairs magazine to come up with a headline story, The New Palestine. And you all understand this as a dangerous significance for all of us. To cut a long story short, we do not want to prolong this issue. It is not a bilateral problem between Bangladesh and Myanmar. The core issue is the problem of the Myanmar government to recognize a group of people as their citizens who have been living there for the last 700 years and who have been living in their own independent states since the beginning. What we want from India here, I think basically we totally agree with India that the sooner we can repatriate these refugees back home, it is safer for all of us. And these Rohingya refugees should be given the full right of a citizen to pursue higher education and to go to schools and hospitals and everything. Because social marginalization will create problem for everybody. And I am very concerned because right now, the more time passes, there will be more and more offers from various countries to repatriate or to settle these Rohingya refugees in their country. And Shem Soran, as the former Foreign Secretary, knows very well the areas that I am referring to. And I do not want that to happen. I want the Rohingya refugees to return to their country. But I will just add only one sentence to this. I served in Middle East for quite some time, and I have come across directly, face to face with Rohingyas. The problem is when a Bangladeshi or an Indian guy has necessary skill to be employed in Middle East, a Rohingya guy is totally illiterate. He cannot learn any basic, he doesn't have any basic skill to be employed. Now, a person who doesn't have any skill is very vulnerable, and he can be used by anyone for any activity. So, somebody may have set fire in the Rakhine province today, but it is all in our interest to put out the fire. The sooner the better. And if we don't do it, it will engulf the entire region. So far, we have exercised maximum restraint. We are still going for Security Council debate without asking anyone to go for a sanction or ostracizing regime, because I know that will create more problems for them. Thank you, sir.
Do you want to, Nimi, do you want to respond? I'm afraid we are out of time. I know there are a few more questions around the table, but thank you all for sort of making it today despite the traffic and other things. I hope the discussion was worth your time, and please join me in thanking our panelists as well today. Thanks. Thank you, Nimi.